Best practices. Let's talk about them. They're not as important as you think they are. They don't just apply to the code you write to get your app to work. They also apply to styling. They apply to testing. You can implement best practices in a multitude of ways into your app. But should you? Well, the main purpose they serve is code quality. You want maintainable code that you can always go back to, understand what it does, and easily switch out, right? It makes communicating with other developers way easier if you all have a certain standard, a code quality that you can all refer to. And this is especially useful if you work in teams. If you work solo, not as much. But not only that, also risk is minimized. If you miscommunicate with other developers on how you write code, that can be really annoying. It can lead to merge conflicts, and that's just a lot of wasted time for everybody involved. So why not set certain best practices you want to implement into your project you do with other developers or by yourself to completely avoid all that altogether? Well, it's true, but on this channel I've had so many interactions with beginners, with intermediates, with senior level pro coders, and it's really interesting to see the different approaches about best practices they all implement. You see, the main difference between beginners and senior level or more advanced programmers that I've noticed is that the understanding of what a best practice is fundamentally different. More advanced programmers understand why these best practices exist, and that allows them to step out of them willingly whenever they want in order to justify innovation. Because stepping out of best practices is A, not uncommon, and B, is sometimes not at all something bad. I'm gonna get to examples in a second. The important thing to understand here is the context and the reason you are applying a best practice in the first place. What does it do for you? Mindlessly copying best practices from projects that you see. What I've noticed again and again with beginners, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Yes, it might impress employers if they first look at it, but when they then ask why you choose to go this way or that way, you won't be able to explain it. It doesn't make sense. Best practices inherently exist to solve a certain problem in a certain, mostly efficient manner. If that problem does not apply to you and you don't understand that, implementing that best practice is of no value to you whatsoever. And what I also see a lot with beginners is they get so worried about if their code follows best practices. I've gotten so many emails asking me to review code if it follows best practices. Look, I totally understand why. You want to write good, maintainable code, especially if you're looking for a job and applying with your GitHub repositories. But what I see so many times is that this striving for best practices really hinders your productivity in writing code. What I tell beginners is just get writing. Write your code, write whatever comes to the top of your mind to get your job done. And then can you refactor, implement best practices as much as you want once the app actually works. Wanting to implement the best code practices from the get-go is an absolute recipe for disaster and unproductivity. If you're not working in an enterprise context, don't worry about it. It's not as important as you think. Now, one area that I want to exclude from this is security. It does make a lot of sense to get into security best practices because just writing what comes to mind in terms of security might not be the best idea, especially if you're handling user data. That's just the single area I want to exclude. Security is very important, but it's also really well documented. You can go back to years of experience as to how people implement sessions, as to how they implement JSON Web Tokens, password authentication, OAuth authentication. It's all really well documented. You can just take a look at other people's implementation and kind of copy them into your app and also understand what's happening. But besides that, don't be so worried about best practices, because chances are, if you're a beginner, it might actually hinder your progress more so than it does you any good. I think the most common case of worrying too much about best practices would be over-optimization in terms of code performance and also in terms of scalability. Something I did not expect, but noticed through comments on the channel sometimes, that people are so worried about how well their app will scale if they have 0 users. It's beyond me. They're worried about if it can scale to 10, 20, 30,000, a million users without having any. And I just don't think it makes sense. Just get building, and once you have the users and the financial resources from the users that you're selling your service to, then you can actually worry about performance upgrades, about scalability upgrades, and worrying about all that while you don't have that many users is really hindering your progress. Talk about file names in React. People have told me that you cannot name your components anything other than what is established in React. I'm not sure how the actual case is called. I bet there's a name for it, like camel case, Pascal case, whatever. The gist of it is that the main letter, the first letter of each kind of word that you're sticking into the component is uppercase and the rest is lowercase. That's a convention, a best practice in React that you are totally free to break out of. And in this case, it's important to understand why this exists. It exists to differentiate between your regular files and your React components if you search for files. It just makes it a bit easier, and it also looks cleaner in the imports, and you can tell right away, okay, this is a React component. If you're not familiar with React, whatever you're familiar with, I bet there's something similar for it. But after understanding that why, if you're working alone on a project or in a project where that is not convention at all, who cares about you breaking out of it if the file names are still readable? Write them in Pascal case, write them with hyphens, it doesn't matter. To summarize it all in one sentence, I personally feel like there's too much should in the community and too little could. Use best practices as tools rather than rigid rules you have to abide by, because that's not what they are. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, and that's gonna be it for me. I'm gonna see you in the next video. Have a good one, and bye bye.